Open up. This is the police. A harsh voice boomed from the other side of the door, making the framed photos on the hallway table vibrate slightly. Sarah, still in her comfortable yoga pants and an old t-shirt, looked at the door with wide, disbelieving eyes. She had been enjoying a rare quiet afternoon, curled up with a book and a mug of chamomile tea. Now, this unexpected and frankly rude interruption shattered her peace. The voice belonged to Officer Miller, a gruff man with a perpetually stern expression, someone she knew slightly from local community events. But it was the woman standing beside him, her face a mask of indignation, who truly sent a jolt of confusion through Sarah. It was Karen, of course. Always Karen. Her perfectly coiffed blonde hair seemed to bristle even more than usual, and her arms were crossed tightly over her chest, as if she were personally offended by the existence of Sarah's front door. Karen, the self-appointed guardian of neighborhood rules, the HOA president who saw every blade of grass out of place as a personal affront. Sarah had moved into this lovely, quiet suburban neighborhood just a few weeks ago with her husband, David, for his new job. They had heard whispers about the HOA, and particularly about Karen, but nothing could have prepared her for this. "Ma'am, we know you're in there." Officer Miller's voice cut through the air again, laced with an impatience that made Sarah's stomach clench. He knocked again, harder this time, a series of rapid, authoritative thuds that echoed through the otherwise silent house. Karen just stood there, a smug look on her face, as if she had just orchestrated the most brilliant tactical maneuver. Sarah's mind raced. Why were they here? She hadn't done anything. Had she? A small, nagging doubt began to form. What rule had she unknowingly broken? The sheer audacity of Karen calling the police because she hadn't answered the door was staggering. Sarah felt a surge of frustration, but also a strange sense of calm. She had handled far tougher situations than a nosy neighbor and an impatient police officer. But this felt different. This felt like a setup. Why was Karen so determined to make her life difficult? And why were the police even here for something so trivial? What would happen next? The story of Sarah and David's move to Willow Creek was supposed to be a fresh start, a new chapter filled with promise and tranquility. David, a talented architect, had landed a fantastic opportunity at a prestigious firm in the city, a role he had dreamed of for years. Sarah, a dedicated community organizer with a passion for helping others, was excited to immerse herself in a new neighborhood, eager to find ways to contribute. They had chosen Willow Creek for its tree-lined streets, the well-maintained homes, and the highly rated local schools, even though they didn't have children yet. It seemed like the perfect place to build their future. Their first few weeks were a whirlwind of unpacking boxes, arranging furniture, and discovering local coffee shops. The house itself was a charming, two-story colonial with a spacious yard, a stark contrast to their previous small apartment. Sarah loved spending her mornings on the front porch, sipping coffee and watching the world wake up. David, meanwhile, was often at his new office, working long hours but always coming home with a smile on his face, energized by his challenging new role. They had met a few of their immediate neighbors, a friendly elderly couple named the Johnsons who lived next door, and a young family across the street with two boisterous boys. Everyone seemed pleasant enough, offering warm smiles and welcoming waves. However, a subtle undercurrent of tension soon became apparent, centered around the enigmatic figure of Karen. She lived 3 houses down, a stately brick residence with an immaculately manicured lawn that seemed to glow unnaturally green. Sarah first encountered Karen during a casual stroll. Karen, with her impeccable posture and an air of perpetual disapproval, introduced herself as the president of the Willow Creek Homeowners Association. Her introduction felt less like a welcome and more like an interrogation. She quizzed Sarah about her moving timeline, the number of vehicles they owned, and even the type of landscaping they planned for their backyard. Sarah, ever the diplomat, tried to be polite, explaining their excitement about joining the community. Karen merely nodded, her eyes scanning Sarah from head to toe, a flicker of something unreadable in their depths. A few days later, a cryptic note appeared in their mailbox, a formal letter from the HOA. It stated, in stark, impersonal language, that their exterior paint color appeared to deviate from the approved palette and requested immediate rectification. Sarah stared at the letter, confused. The house was painted a tasteful, light gray, a color that blended seamlessly with the other homes on the street. It was the same color when they bought the house. David, equally baffled, called their real estate agent, who confirmed the color was standard and had never been an issue before. It was their first brush with Karen's authority, and it felt utterly nonsensical. They decided to ignore it, assuming it was a bureaucratic oversight. The minor annoyances escalated. One afternoon, Sarah was watering the small rose bushes she had planted near the mailbox when Karen walked by, her gaze fixed on the wilting petals. "Those roses," Karen stated, her voice devoid of warmth, "are not on the approved plant list for this section of the community. You'll need to remove them." Sarah, genuinely surprised, explained that she had bought them from a local nursery, unaware of any such list. Karen simply handed her a thick, stapled booklet titled Willow Creek HOA Covenants, Conditions, and Restrictions, its cover emblazoned with a stern-looking oak tree. "All the rules are in here," she declared, "ignorance is not an excuse." Sarah felt a knot of frustration tightening in her stomach. It seemed every small attempt they made to settle into their new home was met with an arbitrary rule or a stern pronouncement from Karen. Then came the incident with the bird feeder. David, a nature enthusiast, had proudly hung a beautiful, wooden bird feeder from a sturdy branch in their backyard, hoping to attract some local cardinals and blue jays. It was a simple, charming addition, bringing a touch of nature closer to their windows. The very next day, another official-looking letter arrived, this one more aggressive in its tone. "Bird feeders are prohibited," it read, "due to potential pest attraction and disruption of natural wildlife patterns." The letter cited a specific bylaw, page 37, section 4b. David, usually laid back, was genuinely annoyed. "A bird feeder," he exclaimed, throwing his hands up in exasperation. "What kind of neighborhood bans bird feeders?" They grudgingly took it down, but the incident left a bitter taste. It felt less like a rule and more like a personal vendetta. The tension continued to simmer. Sarah noticed Karen watching their house more frequently. Sometimes, she would see Karen's curtains twitch as she walked out to get the mail. Other times, she would spot Karen lingering on her porch, ostensibly watering her perfect petunias, but her eyes were always subtly directed toward their property. It made Sarah feel uneasy, as if they were constantly under surveillance. It was a strange, unsettling feeling, being scrutinized for every minor detail of their lives. One particularly sweltering Tuesday, Sarah decided to take a much-needed break from unpacking. She put on her favorite comedy movie, made a large bowl of popcorn, and settled onto the sofa, enjoying the cool blast of the air conditioning. David was at work, and the house was blissfully quiet. She was halfway through the film when the doorbell rang. She paused the movie, wondering who it could be. Perhaps a package delivery. She glanced through the peephole. It was Karen, her face unreadable, standing alone on their porch. Sarah hesitated. She wasn't expecting anyone, and frankly, she wasn't in the mood for another lecture about their lawn or the placement of their recycling bins. She decided to ignore it, hoping Karen would eventually leave. The doorbell rang again, more insistently this time. Then, a series of rapid, aggressive knocks followed. Sarah held her breath, remaining silent. After a few tense minutes, the knocking stopped. Sarah let out a slow exhale, relieved. She unpaused her movie, thinking the ordeal was over. But it wasn't. Barely 10 minutes later, the insistent ringing of the doorbell resumed, even more forceful than before. This time, it was accompanied by loud, booming knocks. "Open up. This is the police." The words, sharp and unexpected, cut through the quiet of the house, and Sarah's heart leaped into her throat. She sprang off the couch, adrenaline coursing through her veins. Peeking through the blinds, she saw Officer Miller, his hand still raised from knocking, and beside him, the unmistakable figure of Karen, her expression a mix of triumph and righteous anger. The sight filled Sarah with a sudden, intense wave of disbelief and fury. This had gone too far. This is outrageous. Sarah muttered under her breath, her hand trembling slightly as she reached for the doorknob. The booming knocks continued, shaking the entire doorframe. She took a deep breath, pushing down the rising tide of anger. Confronting Karen head-on was rarely productive, but now, with a police officer involved, she knew she had to remain calm and composed. She opened the door, a polite yet firm expression on her face. Officer Miller stood there, his face unyielding. Karen, positioned slightly behind him, smirked. Her eyes, usually darting with a strange mix of judgment and self-satisfaction, seemed to glow with a particular intensity. It was clear she was relishing this moment, a culmination of her perceived grievances against Sarah and David. "Ma'am, the Homeowners Association president here, Ms. Davidson, reported a disturbance," Officer Miller began, his voice flat and official. "She claims you refused to answer your door after repeated attempts and that this constitutes a violation of community rules regarding neighborly conduct and responsiveness." Sarah stared at him, dumbfounded. "A disturbance? Refused to answer my door?" She turned her gaze to Karen, who met it with an unblinking, self-righteous stare. "Karen, I was simply resting. I didn't realize I was obligated to answer my door to anyone who knocks, especially when I'm not expecting visitors." Karen stepped forward, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness, a stark contrast to the venom in her eyes. "Oh, Sarah, dear, it's not about being obligated. It's about community harmony. I was merely trying to discuss a minor issue with your landscaping. But your refusal to engage, your blatant disregard for common courtesy, left me no choice. We have rules here, you see. Rules that ensure our neighborhood remains orderly and respectable. Rules about answering your door." Sarah countered, a hint of incredulity creeping into her voice. "Officer, is this truly a police matter? I was in my own home, minding my own business." Officer Miller shifted his weight, his gaze moving between Sarah and Karen. "A mess." Davidson stated she had urgent HOA business to discuss. Failure to cooperate with HOA officials, particularly the president, can sometimes escalate into a nuisance complaint. "We are simply responding to the report." He then added, a touch of weary resignation in his tone, "It's best to try and resolve these matters amicably, ma'am." Sarah felt a surge of frustration. It was clear Officer Miller was just doing his job, caught between a seemingly trivial complaint and a persistent HOA president. But the sheer absurdity of the situation was infuriating. She took another deep breath, forcing herself to maintain a calm demeanor. "Officer, with all due respect, what urgent HOA business could possibly warrant calling the police because I didn't immediately open my door?" Karen interjected before the officer could respond, her voice rising slightly. "It was about the unapproved shade of gray on your house, Sarah. And the rogue rose bushes. And the audacity of that bird feeder, attracting all manner of unsavory creatures." She gestured wildly towards the spot where David's bird feeder had once hung. "These are vital community standards. Your lack of compliance is affecting property values." Sarah crossed her arms. "We have addressed the bird feeder, and the house color was approved by the previous owners. As for the roses, I was unaware of a specific, approved plant list. We are new here, Karen, and we are trying our best to understand the rules. But calling the police for these trivial matters is frankly an abuse of authority and harassment." Officer Miller sighed, pulling out a small notebook. "Ma'am, Ms. Davidson has a right to report what she perceives as a violation. Our role is to investigate. For now, I'm simply advising you to cooperate with HOA requests to avoid further issues. This is a verbal warning. No formal report will be filed unless further incidents occur. He gave Karen a pointed look. And Ms. Davidson, perhaps a direct, scheduled meeting might be more appropriate for these discussions in the future. Karen's smug expression faltered for a moment, but she quickly recovered, nodding primly. Of course, officer. Just trying to maintain order. As Officer Miller turned to leave, Karen lingered for a moment, her eyes fixed on Sarah. Just remember, Sarah, she purred, her voice low and menacing, this is our community. We have standards. And we expect everyone to adhere to them. Or there will be consequences. With that thinly veiled threat, she turned and walked away, her perfect blonde hair swaying slightly as she headed back towards her meticulously manicured lawn. Sarah watched them go, her heart pounding with a mixture of anger and a growing sense of unease. This wasn't just about rules anymore. This felt personal. Karen was determined to make their lives miserable, seemingly for no reason at all. The calm facade Sarah had maintained cracked, replaced by a simmering resentment. She slammed the door shut, leaning against it, trying to process the sheer audacity of what had just happened. A police officer at her door, for not answering a knock. It was beyond ridiculous. David arrived home an hour later, his usual cheerful demeanor replaced by concern when he saw Sarah pacing the living room, a storm brewing in her eyes. She recounted the entire incident, her voice rising with each detail, from Karen's theatrical performance to Officer Miller's reluctant intervention. David listened, his jaw tightening, his initial amusement quickly fading into disbelief and anger. She called the police on you for not answering the door? David exclaimed, running a hand through his hair. That's insane. This woman is completely out of control. This isn't just about HOA rules, Sarah, this is outright harassment. I know, Sarah replied, sinking onto the sofa, feeling utterly drained. It's like she has it in for us. Every minor thing is blown out of proportion. We moved here for peace, David, not to be under constant surveillance by some power-hungry HOA president. David sat beside her, pulling her into a comforting embrace. We'll figure it out, hon, we're not going to let her ruin our new home. There has to be a way to deal with her, a proper channel. He tried to sound reassuring, but Sarah could feel the tension in his own body. He was just as frustrated as she was. Over the next few days, the atmosphere in Willow Creek felt subtly different. Sarah noticed neighbors avoiding eye contact or giving them sympathetic, fleeting glances. It seemed Karen's influence extended beyond just enforcing rules. She controlled the social dynamics of the street. Sarah felt increasingly isolated, despite their attempts to be friendly and integrate. She tried to participate in a neighborhood potluck, but Karen was there, her presence casting a pall over the gathering. Every time Sarah spoke, Karen seemed to subtly interject, steering conversations away or offering thinly veiled criticisms about their settling-in process. One evening, Sarah and David were enjoying a quiet dinner on their back patio when they heard a faint, distressed meow. A tiny, scrawny kitten, no more than a few weeks old, had somehow found its way into their yard, its eyes wide with fear. Sarah's heart melted instantly. She loved animals, and this tiny creature looked hungry and lost. They carefully coaxed it closer with a small bowl of milk and some leftover chicken. The kitten, initially hesitant, eventually crept towards them, purring as Sarah gently stroked its soft fur. They decided to take it in, at least temporarily, while they looked for its owner. They named her Whiskers. Whiskers quickly settled into their home, bringing a much-needed sense of warmth and joy. She was playful and affectionate, chasing sunbeams across the living room floor and curling up on Sarah's lap while she read. Sarah found solace in the kitten's innocent presence, a small bright spot amidst the lingering tension with Karen. David, too, enjoyed having Whiskers around, often playfully wrestling with her after a long day at work. They planned to take her to the vet for a checkup and put up "Found Cat" posters around the neighborhood, hoping to reunite her with her family, if she had one. If not, they were seriously considering keeping her. However, their brief respite from Karen's watchful eye was short-lived. A few days after Whiskers arrived, another, official, letter landed in their mailbox. This one was even more aggressively worded than the previous ones, its language sharp and accusatory. "Animal violations," it blared in bold letters. The letter stated that multiple residents had reported an unregistered and unauthorized feline residing at their address, a direct violation of Section 6A of the HOA bylaws, which prohibited unregistered pets and animals not contained within the owner's dwelling or a secure, HOA-approved enclosure. It demanded immediate removal of the animal or face significant fines and further community action. Sarah crumpled the letter in her hand, her face burning with indignation. "Unregistered feline," she fumed, showing the letter to David. "How could she possibly know about Whiskers? We haven't even had her for a week." David's eyes scanned the letter, his expression growing grim. "This is beyond ridiculous. She must be actively watching our house, looking for anything she can use against us." He sighed, running a hand over his face. "We haven't even had a chance to get her chipped or registered. What are we going to do?" The next morning, as Sarah was getting ready for an appointment, she heard an agitated voice outside. Peeking through the window, her blood ran cold. It was Karen, standing on her lawn, pointing dramatically at their house, speaking animatedly on her phone. As Sarah watched, Karen lowered the phone, her eyes sweeping across their property, a triumphant glint in them. Then, slowly, deliberately, she pulled out her own phone again and began taking pictures of their house. Not just their yard, or a specific spot, but wide shots, as if documenting their entire property. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. This wasn't just a neighborly dispute anymore. This felt like surveillance, a calculated campaign of intimidation. What was Karen planning? And how far would she go? The sense of unease intensified, spiraling into a genuine fear of what Karen's next move might be. The following morning, a crisp, official-looking letter with the HOA's letterhead appeared in Sarah and David's mailbox. It wasn't just a warning, it was a formal notice of an emergency HOA board meeting, specifically called to address repeated and uncorrected violations of community standards by their property. The tone was severe, outlining potential fines, sanctions, and even a forced hearing before the full board. Whiskers, their little found kitten, was explicitly mentioned, her unregistered and unconfined presence cited as a primary infraction. Sarah's hands trembled as she read it, the implications sinking in like cold stones. This wasn't just Karen making noise anymore, this was an organized effort to corner them. David, upon reading the letter, slammed his fist on the kitchen counter, his face flushed with anger. An emergency meeting? For a kitten? This is absurd, Sarah. She's turning the entire HOA against us. He paced back and forth, a vein throbbing in his temple. We need to fight this. We can't let her bully us out of our own home. Sarah, though equally furious, felt a growing sense of helplessness. But how, David? She's the president. She seems to have everyone wrapped around her finger. Every time we try to be reasonable, she just escalates things. She looked at Whiskers, who was playfully batting at a dust bunny under the sofa, oblivious to the storm brewing around her. The thought of having to give her up was heartbreaking. David stopped pacing, a determined glint in his eye. We're going to that meeting. We're going to present our case, calmly and rationally. We'll show them she's being unreasonable. We'll expose her for what she is, a bully misusing her power. The day of the meeting arrived, bringing with it a palpable tension that hung heavy in the air. The community clubhouse, usually a venue for cheerful potlucks and children's birthday parties, felt like a courtroom. The long, polished table was surrounded by stern faces, the other members of the HOA board. Mr. Henderson, a quiet man who owned the local hardware store, sat beside Mrs. Peterson, a retired teacher known for her strict adherence to rules. At the head of the table sat Karen, a triumphant smirk barely concealed on her lips, a stack of papers meticulously organized before her. She was wearing a crisp, professional blazer, as if preparing for a major corporate presentation. Sarah and David walked in, feeling the weight of every eye in the room. They chose seats furthest from Karen, a strategic move to show they weren't intimidated. Karen began the meeting with a dramatic flourish, her voice echoing slightly in the hushed room. She launched into a lengthy, detailed account of their alleged infractions, meticulously citing bylaws and dates. She presented photographic evidence, the pictures she had taken of their house, blown up and arranged on a display board. The rogue rose bushes, the subtle shade of gray on their house, even a close-up of whiskers peeking out from behind a window curtain, were all showcased as egregious violations. Her narrative painted them as defiant, disrespectful newcomers intent on disrupting the peaceful order of Willow Creek. When it was their turn to speak, David, despite his simmering anger, presented their case with remarkable composure. He explained their attempts to comply, their confusion about the unapproved house color, the removal of the bird feeder, and their temporary care for the stray kitten, whom they were actively trying to find a home for or fully adopt legally. Sarah spoke about their desire to be good neighbors, their excitement about joining the community, and her own background in community organization, emphasizing their commitment to positive engagement. They highlighted the disproportionate nature of Karen's actions, arguing that calling the police for trivial matters was an overreach of authority and constituted harassment. As they spoke, Karen frequently interrupted, scoffing, rolling her eyes, and murmuring sarcastic comments under her breath. The other board members listened, their expressions mostly neutral, though Sarah caught a few sympathetic glances from Mr. Henderson. It became clear, however, that Karen's narrative held significant sway. Her long-standing position as president, combined with her forceful personality, had established her as the undeniable authority in the community. The arguments about kindness and empathy, which Sarah had hoped would resonate, seemed to bounce off the walls of rigid rules and perceived order. After their presentation, the board deliberated in hushed whispers. Karen, ever the orchestrator, leaned in, whispering intently to each member, her gestures animated. The tension in the room was suffocating. Finally, she cleared her throat, signaling the end of the discussion. "The board has reached a decision," Karen announced, her voice filled with a self-satisfied tone that made Sarah's stomach churn. "While we acknowledge Mr. and Mrs. Miller's desire to integrate into our community, their repeated failure to adhere to established guidelines, despite warnings, cannot be overlooked. The presence of the unregistered feline, in particular, poses a health and safety risk to the community, as outlined in our bylaws." She paused for dramatic effect. "Therefore, the board unanimously votes to impose a series of fines, effective immediately, for each listed infraction. Furthermore, a non-compliance fee will be levied for every day the aforementioned feline remains on the property beyond 48 hours. Should these conditions not be met, the HOA reserves the right to pursue further legal action, including potential eviction proceedings." Sarah gasped, her blood running cold. Eviction? For a kitten? The fines were substantial, designed to be crippling. It was a declaration of war, a clear message that Karen would stop at nothing to drive them out. David clenched his fists under the table, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. This wasn't a fair judgment, it was a punishment, a calculated move by Karen to assert her absolute dominance. The room felt suddenly very small, the air thick with unspoken triumph from Karen and a heavy sense of defeat for Sarah and David. They left the meeting feeling utterly crushed. The walk home was silent, the weight of the injustice pressing down on them. They were trapped, caught in a Kafkaesque nightmare where trivial rules were weaponized by a vindictive neighbor. The dream of their peaceful new home was crumbling around them. The next few days were a blur of desperation. They called lawyers, but the legal fees were exorbitant, and many cautioned that fighting an HOA, especially one with well-defined bylaws, was an uphill battle. They tried to find a no-kill shelter for Whiskers, but most were full, and Sarah couldn't bear the thought of giving her to a place that might not treat her with kindness. The clock was ticking on the 48-hour deadline. One afternoon, as Sarah was contemplating how to tell David that they might have to give up Whiskers, she heard a commotion outside. A loud, aggressive barking followed by the distinct sound of snarling filled the air. She rushed to the window, her heart leaping into her throat. Her neighbor, Mr. Thompson, a gruff, imposing man known for his two large, unrestrained German shepherds, was yelling. The dogs, usually kept in a pen in his backyard, had somehow gotten loose and were now cornering Whiskers, who had been playfully chasing a butterfly near their back fence. The dogs were barking ferociously, their teeth bared, and Whiskers, tiny and terrified, was huddled against the fence, letting out piteous cries. Mr. Thompson, instead of immediately restraining his dogs, was shouting at Whiskers, blaming her for provoking his animals. Sarah's blood ran cold. This was not just a dog chasing a cat, this looked dangerous. She had seen these dogs before, they were powerful and aggressive. If they got to Whiskers, it would be over. The image of the snarling dogs, the terrified kitten, and Mr. Thompson's indifference filled her with a primal fear. She had to do something, and quickly. Sarah didn't hesitate. Adrenaline surged through her veins, overriding the fear. She burst out the back door, yelling, "Hey! Get away from her!" Her voice, usually soft, cracked with a raw urgency she hadn't known she possessed. Mr. Thompson, startled, turned, his face a picture of annoyance. His German shepherds, however, ignored him, their focus entirely on the terrified kitten. They lunged, barking ferociously, their powerful bodies straining against the invisible leash of Mr. Thompson's passive control. Without thinking, Sarah grabbed the closest thing to hand, a garden hose, and aimed the nozzle. A blast of cold water erupted, hitting the larger of the two dogs squarely in the face. The dog yelped, momentarily disoriented, shaking its head. Sarah advanced, spraying the other dog, her aim surprisingly steady. The second dog, equally surprised, backed away, whining. Mr. Thompson, sputtering, finally managed to grab their collars, pulling them back with considerable effort. "What do you think you're doing, lady?" he bellowed, his face red with a mixture of anger and embarrassment. "Those are my dogs. They're just playing." "Playing?" Sarah retorted, her voice trembling but firm. They were about to attack a helpless kitten. "Keep your dogs on a leash, Mr. Thompson. This is unacceptable." He scowled, dragging his still growling dogs away. "This wouldn't have happened if you didn't have that stray cat running around. It's against HOA rules anyway." He stomped off, muttering threats, his dogs still straining against their leashes, looking back with lingering aggression at Whiskers, who was now trembling uncontrollably. Sarah rushed to Whiskers, scooping the tiny creature into her arms. The kitten was shaking violently, her tiny heart hammering against Sarah's palm. Sarah held her close, whispering soothing words, her own heart still pounding from the confrontation. It had been a close call. Too close. The incident only solidified her resolve. She had to protect this little creature, no matter what Karen or the HOA threw at them. When David came home and heard about the incident, he was livid. "This is it," he declared, his voice tight with anger. "First the police, now an animal attack. This neighborhood is becoming a nightmare. We need to find a way to get out from under Karen's thumb." The brush with danger sparked a new kind of determination in Sarah. She realized that playing by Karen's rules, or simply reacting to her attacks, wasn't enough. They needed to proactively find a solution. She started researching, poring over the HOA bylaws with a fine-tooth comb, not just to understand the rules, but to find loopholes, inconsistencies, or perhaps, forgotten clauses that could work in their favor. David, meanwhile, began reaching out to colleagues and friends, asking for advice on dealing with hostile HOAs. Sarah spent hours online, reading forums about HOA disputes, consulting legal aid websites, and even looking into community organizing tactics. She discovered that many HOAs, particularly smaller ones, often had outdated bylaws or board members who weren't fully aware of their own governing documents. She also learned about the importance of documenting everything, every interaction, every letter, every incident. She started a detailed log, noting dates, times, and specific conversations with Karen and other HOA members. During her research, Sarah stumbled upon a little-known clause buried deep within the Willow Creek HOA bylaws, Section 12C, titled Community Well-Being and Dispute Resolution. It stated that if a resident felt unduly harassed or targeted by the HOA board, particularly by a single individual, they had the right to petition for a full community vote on the individual's removal from their position, provided they gathered signatures from at least 25% of the homeowners. It was a long shot, a massive undertaking, but it was a shot nonetheless. This was the glimmer of hope they desperately needed. "David, look at this!" she exclaimed one evening, pointing to the obscure clause on her laptop screen. "We can challenge her. We can get her removed." David read the clause, his eyes widening. 25%? That's a lot of signatures, Sarah. And Karen has a lot of influence. People are scared of her. "I know," Sarah admitted, "but it's our best shot. If we can convince enough neighbors that she's abusing her power, we might just have a chance. We have to try." They started discreetly. They printed out copies of Section 12C, highlighting the relevant parts. They drafted a polite, non-accusatory petition, simply stating their intent to invoke the clause for a community vote on the HOA presidency, citing concerns regarding arbitrary enforcement of rules and a pattern of unneighborly conduct. They decided to focus on facts and the potential for a more harmonious community, rather than directly attacking Karen. Their first stop was the Johnsons, the kind elderly couple next door. Mrs. Johnson listened patiently, her gentle face creased with concern. "Oh, dear," she said, "Karen can be difficult. She's been president for so long, nobody really dares to challenge her. But what she did to you, calling the police for no reason, and then that poor kitten." Mr. Johnson nodded in agreement. They were hesitant at first, clearly afraid of Karen's retaliation, but Sarah's earnest appeal, combined with their own witnessing of Karen's recent aggressive behavior, finally swayed them. They were the first to sign. Emboldened, Sarah and David began to visit other neighbors, mostly during the evenings when Karen was less likely to be out and about. They approached homeowners who seemed less enthusiastic about Karen, or those who had voiced subtle complaints about her in passing. It was slow, painstaking work. Many residents were polite but quickly shut their doors, clearly unwilling to get involved. Others listened with a sympathetic ear but refused to sign, citing fear of retaliation from Karen. "She makes life difficult if you cross her," one neighbor whispered, clearly nervous. "It's just easier to keep our heads down." Despite the setbacks, there were small victories. A young couple with a newborn, who had recently received an absurd fine for leaving a stroller on their porch, cautiously agreed to sign. A single mother who had been publicly reprimanded by Karen for having slightly overgrown bushes also added her name to the petition. Each signature was a small triumph, a sliver of hope in their uphill battle. The process was emotionally draining. Sarah often returned home feeling disheartened, questioning if they were doing the right thing, if it was worth the constant stress. But then she would look at Whiskers, curled up peacefully on the sofa, or see David's determined face, and she would find renewed resolve. They were fighting for their home, for their peace of mind, and for the kind of community they believed Willow Creek could be, a place built on kindness and understanding, not fear and arbitrary rules. One sunny afternoon, as Sarah was leaving a reluctant neighbor's house, her petition tucked under her arm, she saw a familiar figure emerge from the house directly opposite. It was Karen. She stood on the sidewalk, her arms crossed, watching Sarah with a predatory gaze. Her perfectly styled hair seemed to shimmer in the sunlight, but her eyes held a cold, unwavering intensity. Sarah's heart leaped into her throat. Karen had been talking to the neighbor Sarah had just visited, likely trying to intimidate them or glean information. Karen then started walking purposefully toward Sarah, a chillingly calm expression on her face. Sarah knew, with a sudden, dreadful certainty, that Karen had somehow found out about the petition. The game was no longer subtle, it was about to become very public, and very nasty. Karen approached Sarah, her gait slow and deliberate, a predator closing in on its prey. The sun glinted off her perfectly coiffed hair, but her eyes held a chilling, unyielding gaze. "Well, Sarah," Karen began, her voice a low, dangerous purr, "what exactly are you doing, going door to door with that document?" She emphasized the word document with a sneer, as if it were something vile. "Are you attempting to undermine the duly elected board of this community?" Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs, but she met Karen's gaze directly. "I'm exercising my rights as a homeowner, Karen. Rights that are clearly outlined in the HOA bylaws, Section 12C, to be precise." She held up the petition slightly, not defiantly, but as a simple statement of fact. "I'm gathering support for a community vote regarding the leadership of the HOA. It's a perfectly legal and democratic process." Karen's eyes narrowed, a flicker of genuine surprise crossing her face before it hardened into fury. "Legal? Democratic? You think you can waltz into my community and challenge my authority? I built this HOA, Sarah. I've dedicated years to maintaining order and value here. You're a newcomer, a disruptive influence, and you have no idea who you're dealing with." Her voice rose with each word, tinged with a raw, unbridled anger. "I'm dealing with someone who abuses their power, Karen," Sarah responded, her voice trembling slightly but holding steady. "Someone who calls the police on their neighbors for not answering the door. Someone who threatens eviction over a rescued kitten. That's not maintaining order, that's harassment." Karen let out a sharp, incredulous laugh. "Harassment? Oh, you'll learn what harassment truly is, Sarah. You want to play dirty? Fine. You want to make this a public spectacle? Consider it done." She pointed a perfectly manicured finger at Sarah, her face contorted with rage. "You will regret this, Sarah. Mark my words. You and that husband of yours will wish you never set foot in Willow Creek." With that, she spun on her heel and strode away, her departure as dramatic as her arrival, leaving Sarah shaken but strangely invigorated. The confrontation, though terrifying, had solidified her resolve. There was no turning back now. The battle lines were officially drawn. Karen's retaliation was swift and calculated. The next day, every homeowner in Willow Creek received an email from the HOA, signed by Karen as president. It was a thinly veiled attack on Sarah and David, though it never mentioned them by name. It warned of unscrupulous individuals attempting to sow discord and undermine the stability of our cherished community, urging residents to be wary of misinformation and attempts to subvert established leadership. The email subtly hinted that those who sided with the disruptive elements might find themselves facing increased scrutiny regarding their own property's compliance with HOA rules. It was a clear intimidation tactic, designed to stifle their petition. David, seeing the email, cursed under his breath. "She's trying to isolate us, to turn the whole neighborhood against us." "We knew it wouldn't be easy," Sarah said, trying to remain positive. "But this just shows how desperate she is." "She's afraid, David." They redoubled their efforts, working tirelessly in the evenings, going door to door, sharing their story, and explaining the petition. Some neighbors, swayed by Karen's email, became even more reluctant. Others, however, seeing Karen's aggressive tactics, started to view her with suspicion. A few homeowners, who had previously been too scared to sign, now hesitantly added their names, whispering their own grievances about Karen's overbearing nature. "She fined me for leaving my trash cans out for an extra hour," one elderly woman confided, signing with a shaky hand. "I'm sick of living in fear of her." Slowly, painfully, they inched closer to their goal. The pressure mounted daily. Mysterious flyers started appearing on cars and lampposts around the neighborhood, anonymously printed, full of false accusations against Sarah and David. They claimed Sarah was a known instigator and David had dubious financial dealings in his past, all designed to smear their reputations. Their mailbox was repeatedly stuffed with hateful, unsigned notes. One morning, they woke up to find their front lawn covered in toilet paper, a childish but unsettling act of vandalism. It was clear Karen or her loyalists were behind it all. Despite the harassment, Sarah and David persevered. They cleaned up the mess, ignored the anonymous notes, and focused on their mission. They started documenting everything again, the hateful notes, the vandalism, the dates and times, even taking pictures. They knew they needed a complete record of Karen's escalating tactics. Then came the incident with the sprinkler system. One particularly hot afternoon, Sarah noticed a large puddle forming on their front lawn. When David investigated, he discovered that their main sprinkler valve, located near the curb and usually securely shut off, had been tampered with. It had been opened to full blast, causing their lawn to flood and wasting an enormous amount of water. It was clearly deliberate, and a subtle but effective way to run up their water bill and potentially damage their property. They immediately suspected Karen, but they had no concrete proof. The stress began to take its toll. Sleep became elusive, and every knock at the door, every car driving slowly past their house, sent a jolt of anxiety through Sarah. David was working longer hours, not just at his job, but also on the petition, and the strain was evident on his face. Whiskers, sensing their distress, often stayed close, offering quiet comfort. Finally, after weeks of relentless effort, they reached their goal. They had enough signatures. The required 25% of homeowners had signed the petition to call for a vote on Karen's removal from the HOA presidency. It was a monumental achievement, a testament to their persistence and the quiet discontent simmering beneath Willow Creek's placid surface. They carefully compiled the petition, cross-referencing names and addresses to ensure every signature was valid. The moment they dropped the thick envelope, containing the petition, into the HOA's official mailbox, a sense of cautious triumph washed over them. It was done. The mechanism was in motion. The bylaws dictated that an emergency community meeting and vote had to be scheduled within 2 weeks of receiving such a petition. The news spread like wildfire through the neighborhood. Karen, of course, was furious. She sent out another scathing email, this one even more desperate, attempting to discredit the petition and those who signed it. She called individual homeowners, pressuring them to retract their signatures. But the momentum had shifted. People were talking, openly discussing Karen's behavior, sharing their own stories of her arbitrary rule enforcement and intimidation. The quiet discontent had found a voice. A week later, the official notice arrived. A community-wide meeting was scheduled for the following Saturday at the clubhouse, the sole purpose of which was to hold a vote of no confidence in the current HOA president. The meeting was expected to be a contentious one, with Karen undoubtedly planning a final, dramatic stand. The week leading up to the vote was a blur of frantic preparation. Sarah and David spent every spare moment planning their presentation, gathering all their documentation, the police report, the numerous warning letters, the fines, the anonymous notes, the photographs of the vandalism, and even records of Mr. Thompson's unleashed dogs. They wanted to present an irrefutable case against Karen's abuse of power. On the morning of the vote, Sarah felt a mixture of nervousness and fierce resolve. This was it. Their chance to reclaim their peace, to stand up to the bully. David held her hand, offering a reassuring squeeze. "We've got this, Sarah. We've shown them the truth." They arrived at the clubhouse early, wanting to ensure they had everything ready. The room was already filling up, a buzz of nervous energy filling the air. Neighbors who had signed their petition offered encouraging smiles, while others, loyal to Karen, eyed them coldly. Karen herself arrived shortly after, flanked by a few of her staunch supporters, her face a mask of determined defiance. She swept into the room, her gaze fixed on Sarah and David, a subtle, chilling smile playing on her lips. As the meeting began, and the preliminary remarks were made, Sarah felt a sudden chill. The air in the room seemed to thicken. Then, as the HOA secretary called the meeting to order, Karen stood up, not looking at the board, but directly at Sarah. "Before we proceed," Karen announced, her voice eerily calm, "I have one final point to make, one last measure to ensure community safety and order." Her eyes held a glint of something malicious, a depth of vengeful intent that sent a shiver down Sarah's spine. "I have called for an immediate inspection of the Miller property. Right now." Her gaze hardened, unwavering. "And I have brought someone to ensure it is done properly." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Who had she brought? What was she planning? The very public, sudden nature of this announcement, and the menacing look in Karen's eyes, suggested something far more sinister than a simple inspection. A ripple of murmurs spread through the clubhouse as Karen's words hung in the air. Her declaration of an immediate inspection, coupled with her menacing tone, sent a shiver down Sarah's spine. What new trick was this? Who could Karen possibly have brought to conduct an inspection in the middle of a heated HOA meeting? The tension in the room crackled, anticipation thick in the air. Karen, her eyes gleaming with malicious satisfaction, gestured towards the double doors at the back of the clubhouse. "Officer Miller, if you would be so kind," she announced, her voice dripping with triumph. Sarah's stomach dropped. Officer Miller again? This was beyond a simple inspection. Karen was using the police to intimidate them, right here, in front of the entire community. A collective gasp went through the room as the doors swung open, revealing not just Officer Miller, but another figure beside him. This individual walked with an undeniable aura of authority, their uniform crisp, their posture erect. As they stepped fully into the room, a collective silence fell. The murmurs died down. Jaws dropped. Karen's triumphant smirk slowly, agonizingly, dissolved into a look of utter horror. Officer Miller himself looked visibly uncomfortable, almost sheepish, as he followed slightly behind the new arrival. The person was a woman, tall and commanding, with a stern yet intelligent face framed by dark, pulled-back hair. Her uniform was different from Officer Miller's, it was that of a police chief. And as she looked around the room, her gaze sweeping over the stunned faces, it finally landed on Karen, then moved to Sarah and David, a flicker of something unreadable in her eyes. "Chief Ramirez," she stated, her voice calm and clear, cutting through the stunned silence. "I understand there's a community dispute here, and a request for my department's assistance with a property inspection?" Her eyes landed on Karen, sharp and questioning. Karen, utterly pale, stammered, "See, Chief? But I asked for Officer Miller. Why are you here?" Her voice was a terrified whisper, completely devoid of its usual power. Chief Ramirez raised an eyebrow, a subtle hint of amusement playing on her lips. "Officer Miller informed me of a rather persistent and unusual complaint regarding a homeowner. He also mentioned a pattern of calls from this community that seemed to be disproportionate and, frankly, misdirected. As the new police chief of Willow Creek, I decided it was time to personally assess the situation." She paused, her gaze fixing on Sarah. "And it seems," she continued, her voice gaining a surprising warmth as she looked at Sarah, "I've stumbled upon a familiar face." Sarah, still reeling from the shock, felt a wave of recognition wash over her. The stern face, the intelligent eyes, it clicked. "Rachel," she breathed, stepping forward, a genuine smile replacing her fear. "Rachel Ramirez?" Chief Ramirez smiled fully, a rare, genuine smile that transformed her features. "Sarah Miller. It's been too long." The room erupted in whispers. Karen stood frozen, her face ashen. The other HOA board members stared, completely bewildered. Officer Miller looked at the floor, clearly wanting to disappear. "You two know each other," someone finally managed to stammer. Chief Ramirez nodded, her smile fading as she turned back to the stunned crowd, her expression becoming serious once more. "Indeed. Sarah and I worked together extensively in our previous city. She was instrumental in establishing several highly successful community outreach programs, particularly those focused on resolving neighborhood disputes through mediation and empathy, rather than punitive measures. She actually helped design some of the very community policing initiatives that I was so proud to implement." A ripple of murmurs, this time of surprise and awe, spread through the room. Sarah, the disruptive influence, the unscrupulous individual, was suddenly revealed to be a respected figure with deep connections to the very person Karen had unwittingly called in to validate her reign of terror. Chief Ramirez then turned her piercing gaze on Karen. "Ms. Davidson," she said, her voice now devoid of any warmth, "my department has received numerous calls from this address, all initiated by you, concerning matters that are clearly civil disputes, not criminal. We have records of calls for minor landscaping issues, perceived unneighborly conduct for not answering a door, and even an unregistered feline, an issue that escalated to a full HOA hearing, yet somehow warranted police involvement in your initial report." She paused, letting her words sink in. "This constitutes a severe misuse of police resources. It diverts our officers from genuine emergencies and places an undue burden on community services." Karen tried to speak, but no words came out. She just opened and closed her mouth, her eyes darting frantically around the room, desperately seeking an escape. Furthermore, Chief Ramirez continued, her voice gaining a steely edge, "I have been made aware of a petition, legitimately filed by homeowners, regarding concerns about the HOA's leadership and the alleged pattern of harassment against certain residents. My office takes allegations of harassment very seriously, especially when they involve the abuse of authority." Her gaze swept over the other HOA board members. "And I also understand there was an incident with unleashed dogs just yesterday, and a report has already been filed about it by Mrs. Miller. That is a very real public safety concern." She then turned back to the entire assembled community. "My role as chief of police is to ensure the safety and well-being of all residents of Willow Creek. This includes fostering a respectful and harmonious environment, free from intimidation and undue stress. It is clear that the current HOA leadership, particularly Ms. Davidson, has, whether intentionally or unintentionally, created an atmosphere of fear and division, rather than unity." Chief Ramirez walked directly to the head of the table, pulling out the chair at the side. "Officer Miller, please take statements from any homeowner who feels they have been unduly harassed or subjected to disproportionate enforcement of HOA rules." She then looked at the stack of papers Karen had so meticulously prepared for her accusations. "And Ms. Davidson, I will need to see your complete records regarding all official complaints filed against the Millers, as well as any other residents, going back as far as you have them. My office will be conducting a full review of all past HOA-related police calls and reports from this community, particularly those initiated by the HOA president." Karen slumped into her chair, utterly defeated, her earlier triumph completely evaporated, replaced by palpable dread. The room buzzed with a newfound energy, a sense of relief and quiet vindication washing over many of the residents. Mr. Johnson, the kind neighbor, gave Sarah a small, knowing smile. The young couple with the newborn exchanged a look of pure astonishment and hope. The meeting, intended to be a public condemnation of Sarah and David, had dramatically turned into Karen's public downfall. The very weapon she had wielded, the police, had become the instrument of her undoing, brought forth by her own hubris. Sarah looked at David, a silent understanding passing between them. Their long, difficult fight was finally over. Willow Creek was about to get the fresh start they had always dreamed of.